She accepted his rejection without crying. Her silence broke the Alpha King more than any tears. Winter arrived that year with the elegance of a monarch and the cruelty of a creditor. Snow draped the rooftops of Blackthorne City in silver lace, softening the sharp edges of stone mansions and gilded churches. Yet beneath that beautiful disguise, society remained as merciless as ever. No frost bit deeper than public judgment, and no storm traveled faster than gossip. On the final evening of December, the grand ballroom of Ashbourne Palace blazed with light. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of distinguished guests, scattering gold across polished marble floors. Violins sang from a raised gallery while noble women glided through the crowd in silk and velvet, their jewels flashing like captured stars. Every smile concealed an opinion, every bow disguised an evaluation. In such circles, reputations could be ruined between the beginning of a waltz and its final note. Among the gathering stood Lady Eleanor Ashford. She wore no extravagant diamonds. The financial collapse of her family had long since reduced such luxuries to memories. Yet there remained something about her that neither poverty nor scandal could erase. Her pale blue gown was modest compared to those around her, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that transformed simplicity into elegance. Dark chestnut curls framed a face untouched by vanity, while calm gray eyes surveyed the room with gentle restraint. Many noticed her. Few greeted her. Months earlier, her father's business empire had fallen apart amid accusations of reckless investments and unpaid debts. Though no crime had been proven, society required no evidence when speculation proved more entertaining. Invitations disappeared. Friends became strangers. Doors that once opened eagerly now remained closed. Tonight's ball represented something different. A possibility. A rumor had circulated for weeks through drawing rooms and private clubs. It suggested that Lord Alexander Blackthorne, the Alpha King himself, intended to announce an official courtship before the season ended. And everyone believed the future bride would be Eleanor. Years ago, before misfortune darkened her family name, their connection had seemed almost inevitable. They belonged to the same social world. They possessed matching intelligence, similar values, and an ease with one another that many had quietly admired. Though no formal understanding had ever existed, society had written its own romantic conclusion. Tonight, people expected that conclusion to become reality. Whispers followed Eleanor wherever she moved. She appears remarkably calm. Would you not be if you expected a crown? They say His Majesty has admired her for years. Perhaps fortune is finally returning to the Ashfords. Eleanor heard fragments of every conversation. She pretended otherwise. Near the ballroom's towering windows, she watched snowflakes drift beyond the glass while attempting to ignore the weight of expectation pressing against her shoulders. She had never encouraged the rumors. She had never asked for anyone's sympathy. Yet she understood exactly why she had been invited. Society loved redemption stories almost as much as it loved disgrace. Then the music stopped. The change swept across the ballroom like a sudden wind. Conversations faded. Heads turned. The massive doors opened. Lord Alexander Blackthorne entered. Power seemed to accompany him as naturally as breath. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved through the crowd with effortless confidence. His black formal coat fit with military precision, while his composed expression revealed nothing of his thoughts. Noblemen respected him. Rivals feared him. Newspapers praised him. Women admired him. Yet tonight his gaze appeared unusually distant. The crowd parted before him. Silence settled. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken despite herself. For a brief moment their eyes met across the room. Something unreadable flickered in his expression. Then it vanished. An elderly duke approached Alexander first, offering congratulations before any announcement had even been made. Laughter rippled through nearby groups. The assumption seemed universal. The king raised one hand. The room fell completely still. "My friends," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall, "I understand certain expectations have arisen regarding my future." Smiles appeared. Several ladies exchanged excited glances. Eleanor remained motionless. Alexander continued, "It is therefore necessary that I address those expectations directly." A strange unease touched the air. The violins had ceased entirely. Even the servants seemed frozen. His eyes found Eleanor once more. Every instinct warned her that something was wrong. "Lady Eleanor Ashford is deserving of respect and admiration," he said carefully. "However, I wish it understood that there shall be no future alliance between House Blackthorne and House Ashford." The words landed with the force of shattered glass. Gasps erupted throughout the ballroom. Shock raced through every corner of the hall. A woman dropped her fan. Someone whispered, "Good heavens." Another muttered, "In public?" The humiliation was immediate, complete, and impossible to misunderstand. Alexander had not merely rejected a courtship. He had rejected her. Before witnesses, before rivals, before the very society already eager to watch her fail. Dozens of eyes turned toward Eleanor. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected heartbreak displayed for their entertainment. Instead, she stood perfectly still. The silence stretched. Then Eleanor stepped forward. Her face remained composed, though the color had drained from her cheeks. She lowered her head in a graceful bow. "Your Majesty owes me neither affection nor explanation," she said softly. No trembling voice. No accusation. No bitterness. Only dignity. The restraint struck the room harder than any outburst could have. For the first time that evening, Alexander's composure cracked. Only slightly. Only for a heartbeat. But Eleanor saw it. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the exit. The crowd parted before her, suddenly ashamed to meet her gaze. Behind her, whispers resumed like distant thunder. Ahead of her, the palace doors opened onto a world of falling snow and freezing wind. She entered her waiting carriage and disappeared into the winter darkness. Yet long after the wheels vanished beyond the gates, Alexander remained standing beside the ballroom window, staring into the storm. Around him, conversation slowly returned, but he heard none of it. The image that refused to leave him was not her humiliation. It was her silence. And for the first time in many years, the most powerful man in the kingdom felt the unmistakable weight of regret. Winter deepened across the kingdom, laying its white hand upon fields, rooftops, and forgotten roads, yet the cold beyond Lady Eleanor Ashford's windows felt kinder than the chill she encountered in society. The weeks following the ball transformed her public humiliation into a fashionable amusement. Drawing rooms echoed with embellished versions of the event. Newspapers hinted at rejection without naming names. Ladies who had once sought her company now crossed streets to avoid greeting her. The kingdom had been denied tears that evening, so it compensated by inventing them afterward. Eleanor endured it all with the same quiet dignity she had displayed beneath the chandeliers of Ashbourne Palace. Her family's estate stood several miles beyond the city, surrounded by bare trees and snow-covered gardens sleeping beneath the season's frost. Though reduced from its former grandeur, the house remained graceful, with ivy-covered stone walls and tall windows that welcomed pale winter sunlight. Here, away from crowded salons and judgmental whispers, she devoted her days to reading, correspondence, and caring for her aging father, whose health had declined since the collapse of his fortunes. Yet solitude did not entirely silence the world. One snowy morning, a carriage arrived bearing no family crest. The footman delivered a carefully wrapped parcel. "There is no sender listed, my lady," he explained. Eleanor accepted the package with mild curiosity. Inside rested a rare volume of poetry bound in deep blue leather. For a long moment she simply stared. Years earlier she had admired that exact edition while visiting a bookseller in London. She had mentioned it only once during a conversation she scarcely remembered. The gift felt strangely personal. A small card accompanied it. No signature. No explanation. Only a single sentence. "For a lady whose strength deserves admiration." Eleanor read the words twice before setting them aside. Someone had made a mistake. There could be no other explanation. She instructed the servants to inquire discreetly, yet no source could be discovered. The mystery lingered at the edge of her thoughts, unsettling but harmless. A week later another package arrived. This time it contained winter roses. Their crimson petals seemed almost impossible amid the frozen season. The flowers filled her sitting room with delicate fragrance. Again there was no name. Again there was only a brief note. Beauty should not disappear simply because others failed to recognize it. The words troubled her more than the flowers themselves. Whoever sent them appeared to know not only her circumstances but also her wounds. Outside her estate, rumors continued multiplying. Society possessed an endless appetite for stories, particularly when involving fallen nobility. Some insisted Eleanor secretly corresponded with a foreign aristocrat. Others claimed she had inherited hidden wealth. A few suggested she planned to secure a husband through calculated manipulation. The theories grew increasingly absurd. Meanwhile, another gift arrived. Then another. A silver music box carved with intricate roses. A hand-woven shawl from London's finest merchants. A collection of pressed flowers preserved between delicate pages. Each item reflected remarkable thoughtfulness. Each item revealed careful attention. and each item arrived anonymously. Eleanor found herself increasingly unsettled. Not because the gifts were unwelcome, because they felt impossible. No admirer had ever courted her with such quiet understanding. No friend possessed such intimate knowledge of her preferences. One evening, as snow drifted beyond the library windows, she opened the music box. A soft melody emerged. Gentle, melancholy, familiar. Suddenly she remembered. Years earlier, during a garden party, she had mentioned loving that particular composition. Only one person had been present for the conversation. The realization sent an unexpected tremor through her chest. Alexander. She closed the music box immediately. The possibility seemed absurd. After all, why would the man who had publicly rejected her begin sending anonymous kindness? The contradiction made no sense. Yet the thought refused to leave. Across the kingdom, Alexander Blackthorne wrestled with troubles of his own. His public life remained unchanged. He attended council meetings. He addressed political concerns. He fulfilled every obligation expected of a king. Yet beneath that polished routine lingered a growing unrest. Night after night he remembered Eleanor standing beneath crystal light, accepting humiliation without accusation. He remembered the absence of tears, the absence of anger, the absence of self-pity. Most of all, he remembered the quiet grace with which she had walked away. Regret became a persistent companion. His closest confidant, Lord Nathaniel Graves, noticed the change. One evening beside a crackling fire, Nathaniel regarded him carefully. "You are thinking of her again." Alexander stared into the flames. "I never stopped." "Then why continue this torment?" The king remained silent for several moments. Finally he spoke. "A woman's tears may be forgotten by morning. Her silence remains for years." Nathaniel offered no reply. There was nothing to say, because both men understood the truth. Alexander had expected outrage. Instead he had received dignity. And dignity possessed a terrible power. As winter approached its harshest weeks, the anonymous gifts became impossible for society to ignore. Servants talked. Merchants speculated. Observers connected details. Before long, whispers traveled from estate to estate. Someone important was pursuing Lady Eleanor Ashford. The mystery transformed into fascination. Fascination transformed into scandal. Then came the article. Published in the kingdom's most notorious gossip paper, it appeared beneath a dramatic headline suggesting a secret connection between the fallen Ashford daughter and the Alpha King himself. No evidence accompanied the accusation. Evidence was unnecessary. The suggestion alone proved explosive. By noon, the story dominated every conversation. By evening, noble families treated it as established fact. Some condemned Eleanor. Others mocked her. A few envied her. Yet none remained indifferent. When a copy of the newspaper reached Ashford Manor, Eleanor read the article in stunned silence. The words blurred before her eyes. For the first time since the ballroom, genuine anger flickered beneath her composure. Not because society doubted her. Because someone had dragged her name back into public spectacle. That night a storm swept across the countryside. Wind rattled the windows while snow spiraled through darkness beyond the glass. Near midnight, a servant knocked softly upon her chamber door and presented a sealed envelope delivered moments earlier by a lone rider. Eleanor broke the wax seal and unfolded the note. There were only 7 words written in elegant handwriting. "Meet me. Tomorrow evening. Conservatory. Alone." Beneath the message stood a single letter. The following evening arrived beneath a sky heavy with rain clouds, as though nature itself hesitated between storm and surrender. Long before sunset, Lady Eleanor Ashford found herself unable to concentrate on her books or correspondence. The note rested upon her desk, its brief message possessing a weight far greater than its few words. She had spent the entire day considering whether to ignore it. Prudence advised refusal. Pride demanded refusal. Yet curiosity, that most dangerous companion of the wounded heart, quietly prevailed. By twilight, a fine rain had begun to fall. Wrapped in a dark cloak, Eleanor traveled alone to the abandoned conservatory mentioned in the note. The structure stood on the edge of an old estate several miles beyond the city, hidden among ancient trees whose bare branches twisted against the dim sky. Once celebrated for exotic flowers and lavish gatherings, the glass pavilion had long since been forgotten. Time had weathered its stone foundations, yet much of its beauty endured. Golden light glowed faintly through the misted panes. Someone was waiting. Eleanor paused at the entrance. For one brief moment she considered turning back. Then she stepped inside. Warmth greeted her immediately. Rain tapped gently against the glass ceiling overhead while lanterns illuminated winding pathways lined with winter-blooming flowers. White orchids, crimson camellias, and pale roses filled the air with delicate fragrance. The scene felt strangely dreamlike, suspended somewhere between memory and reality. At the center of the conservatory stood Alexander Blackthorne. He faced away from her initially, his attention fixed upon the rain sliding down the glass walls. When he turned, neither spoke. The silence carried no awkwardness. Only history. Only unfinished things. Alexander inclined his head respectfully. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor removed her gloves slowly. "You created sufficient mystery to make refusal difficult." A faint smile touched his expression. The sight startled her. Not because it was handsome. Because it looked sincere. For several moments they simply walked through the conservatory, surrounded by flowers thriving despite winter's attempts to extinguish them. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Finally Eleanor stopped. "I believe explanations are expected." Alexander exhaled quietly. "They are." His gaze lowered briefly. Then he spoke with unusual directness. "The gifts were from me." The confession hung between them. Eleanor had suspected the truth. Hearing it spoken aloud altered everything. "The books?" she asked. "Yes." "The roses?" "Yes." "The music box?" A shadow crossed his face. "Especially the music box." Rain intensified overhead. Neither looked away. "Why?" Eleanor asked softly. Alexander searched for an answer worthy of the question. "None seemed sufficient." "Because I could not forget." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than any polished excuse would have. For the first time, the powerful king standing before her seemed less like a ruler and more like a man carrying an invisible burden. "You publicly rejected me," she said. "I know." "And afterward you sent kindness in secret." "I know." The contradiction lingered between them. Painful. Unavoidable. Alexander moved toward one of the flower-lined pathways. "Eleanor, there are truths I should have spoken long ago." The use of her name felt unexpectedly intimate. She followed him. Years of restraint had prepared her for disappointment, not vulnerability. "When your family still held its position," Alexander continued, "I intended to pursue you formally." She remained silent. Not because she doubted him. Because part of her had always suspected it. "There were discussions," he said. "Plans. Expectations. What changed?" The question emerged quietly. Yet it carried the weight of everything. Alexander stopped walking. Outside, rain streaked the glass walls like tears the sky itself refused to hide. My counsel intervened. Understanding flickered across Eleanor's face. Political considerations. Strategic alliances. Power. The familiar machinery of aristocratic life. "They argued your family's financial collapse made any association dangerous," he said. "They insisted a future king could not risk appearing vulnerable." Eleanor laughed softly. Not with amusement. With sadness. How practical. Every word struck him harder than anger would have. "I fought them initially." Initially. The single word exposed the truth. Alexander accepted it. Yes. For the first time since entering the conservatory, shame appeared openly in his eyes. Not royal responsibility. Not calculated diplomacy. Shame. He had yielded. He had allowed fear to speak louder than conviction. Eleanor walked toward a cluster of white roses blooming beneath a lantern. Their petals glowed softly against the darkness. "When you rejected me," she said, "everyone assumed my pain came from losing you." Alexander listened carefully. It did not. The admission surprised him. Eleanor touched a rose delicately. "The wound was not your refusal." She paused. Rain whispered overhead. "It was discovering how easily the world agreed with you." The words settled into the silence with devastating gentleness. Alexander felt them more deeply than any accusation. Because they were true. Society had not mourned her humiliation. It had celebrated it. Not because she lacked worth. Because her misfortune made cruelty acceptable. Eleanor turned toward him. "There is a peculiar loneliness in realizing your value was measured entirely by circumstances." For a moment neither moved. The conservatory seemed impossibly still. Then Alexander stepped closer. Not enough to touch her. Only enough to bridge part of the distance. "I was wrong." No excuses followed. No qualifications. No attempt to lessen responsibility. Simply truth. Eleanor studied him carefully. The confession felt genuine. That made it more dangerous. Because genuine remorse possessed the power to awaken hope. and hope often inflicted deeper wounds than rejection. I spent months convincing myself I had done the honorable thing, Alexander admitted. And now I believe honor would have required courage. Something shifted between them. Not forgiveness, not reconciliation, but understanding. The first fragile bridge spanning a painful divide. For the first time in months, Eleanor allowed herself to see the man beneath the title. The man who remembered forgotten conversations. The man who had chosen flowers she loved. The man who looked at her now with unmistakable regret. A different future seemed briefly imaginable. Alexander felt it too. The possibility frightened him, because it inspired a confession even greater than the one already spoken. 3 words pressed against his restraint. 3 words he had carried silently for years. He almost spoke them. Almost. Then caution intervened. Not political caution. Personal fear. The fear of hearing refusal. The fear of arriving too late. The moment passed. Neither acknowledged it. Outside, however, unseen eyes watched the illuminated conservatory through rain-covered branches. Hidden beneath dark cloaks, 2 members of the powerful Ravensshire family observed every movement with growing satisfaction. Society's most ambitious dynasty had been searching for leverage against the Alpha King for months. Now at last they possessed it. As Eleanor prepared to leave and Alexander escorted her toward the entrance, neither realized their private meeting had already become tomorrow's scandal. Yet as the carriage disappeared into the rain and Alexander remained standing beneath the lantern light, one truth settled heavily within him. He was no longer protecting a throne from controversy. He was protecting Eleanor from the consequences of loving him. The scandal erupted exactly as the Ravensshire family had intended. Within 48 hours of the secret meeting, every drawing room in the kingdom buzzed with speculation. Newspapers published dramatic accounts of a mysterious midnight rendezvous between Lady Eleanor Ashford and the Alpha King. Details varied wildly depending on the storyteller, but the conclusion remained identical. Society had found a new spectacle. And this time, it intended to devour Eleanor completely. By the end of the week, invitations ceased arriving altogether. Ladies who had once exchanged polite greetings suddenly treated her existence as an inconvenience. Gentlemen who prided themselves on honor repeated gossip they could not verify. The story grew with every retelling until truth became nearly impossible to distinguish from invention. To many observers, Eleanor had transformed from a humiliated woman into an ambitious schemer. The cruelty would have been almost impressive had it not been so predictable. Yet what wounded her most was not the malice of strangers. It was the exhaustion. The constant necessity of defending a reputation she had never endangered. The endless burden of carrying dignity through a society determined to strip it away. One afternoon, seated beside the library window at Ashford Manor, she watched snow drift across the gardens while another newspaper lay folded upon her desk. She had stopped reading them. The words changed. The accusations remained. For the first time since the ballroom, uncertainty entered her heart. Not uncertainty regarding Alexander. Uncertainty regarding herself. How much strength could one person spend before there was nothing left? Meanwhile, at Blackthorne Palace, a different battle unfolded. Alexander stood before the royal council beneath soaring ceilings painted with scenes of ancient victories. Powerful men occupied the chamber's long table. Dukes, ministers, advisors, and political allies regarded him with varying degrees of concern. None appeared pleased. "The rumors must be addressed immediately," declared Lord Whitmore. "They already have been addressed," Alexander replied calmly. "Not publicly." A second advisor leaned forward. "Your Majesty, the kingdom is watching. Every day your silence encourages further speculation." Alexander remained standing, unmoved. For years he had mastered the art of political composure. Today that composure felt increasingly fragile. One elderly minister cleared his throat. "Respectfully, sire, Lady Ashford has become a liability." The room fell silent. Several council members lowered their eyes. Even among politicians, some truths felt uncomfortable when spoken aloud. Alexander's expression hardened. A liability. The minister shifted uneasily. From a political perspective, there it was. The same argument. The same cold arithmetic. The same reasoning that had persuaded him to reject Eleanor months earlier. For one terrible moment, he heard echoes of his own past decisions. Then he remembered the conservatory. He remembered her voice. "The wound was not your refusal. It was discovering how easily the world agreed with you." Shame tightened around his chest. Because he had been part of that world. Perhaps its most powerful participant. Slowly, Alexander looked around the chamber. At the advisors. At the ministers. At the men who measured human worth against convenience. Something within him finally reached its limit. "I am beginning to suspect," he said quietly, "that politics is merely another word for cowardice." Shock swept through the room. No one responded. No one dared. The meeting ended shortly afterward. Yet the pressure continued. Letters arrived. Warnings followed. Several noble families privately threatened to withdraw support should the scandal worsen. Others suggested immediate distance from Eleanor. Every recommendation pointed toward the same solution. Protect the throne. Abandon the woman. Once, Alexander might have listened. Not anymore. Days later, the kingdom gathered for the Winter Assembly, the most prestigious social event of the season. Nobility traveled from every corner of the realm to attend. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers, mirrors, and thousands of candle flames. Music drifted through the air while aristocrats exchanged greetings beneath ceilings adorned with gold leaf and painted cherubs. Eleanor had not intended to attend. Only her father's encouragement persuaded her otherwise. "You have done nothing wrong," he told her gently. For his sake she came. The moment she entered the hall, conversations faltered. Whispers followed immediately. Curious eyes tracked her movements. Judgment lingered everywhere. Yet she walked forward with her usual grace. The room expected embarrassment. She offered composure. Hours passed. The atmosphere remained tense. Then everything changed. A herald's voice echoed through the assembly. "The Alpha King." Every guest turned. Alexander entered wearing formal black evening attire adorned with the insignia of his office. Authority accompanied him naturally, yet tonight something else traveled beside it. Purpose. He moved through the crowd without hesitation. Without distraction. Without concern for appearances. The room sensed it immediately. Conversations faded. Music stopped. Even the orchestra lowered their instruments. Alexander approached the central platform. Silence spread across the hall. The kind of silence that arrives moments before history alters its course. He surveyed the gathering. Hundreds of faces stared back. Waiting. Speculating. Judging. Then his gaze found Eleanor. For one heartbeat, the rest of the world disappeared. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through every corner of the room. "I understand there has been considerable discussion regarding Lady Eleanor Ashford." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Alexander continued. "Much of that discussion has been dishonest." The murmurs vanished. Shock replaced them. Several members of the Ravensshire family visibly stiffened. The king descended from the platform. Step by deliberate step. Toward Eleanor. Toward the center of the scandal. Toward the truth. Every eye followed him. Every breath seemed suspended. When he reached her, he turned and faced the assembly once more. His expression remained calm. His voice did not waver. "If blame must be assigned," he declared, "let every finger point toward me." A collective gasp swept through the hall. The words struck like thunder. Alexander stood unwavering beneath the weight of astonishment. "I will not permit another whisper against her honor." Silence followed. Absolute silence. Not because society lacked opinions. Because society had lost the courage to voice them. The declaration shattered months of gossip in a single moment. For the first time since the ballroom, Eleanor felt her carefully guarded composure falter. Not from humiliation. From disbelief. He was risking everything. His reputation. His alliances. His political standing. All for her. Alexander turned toward her fully. The world seemed to disappear again. There were no nobles. No newspapers. No scandals. Only two people standing amid the ruins of old mistakes. His eyes held a depth she had never seen before. Not regret. Not duty. Something far more dangerous. Something impossible to misunderstand. Then, before the stunned kingdom, he extended his hand. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, though every person in the hall heard the words, "may I speak with you privately?" And as she stared at the hand he offered, the entire kingdom waited for her answer. For several suspended seconds, the grand assembly seemed to forget how to breathe. Hundreds of guests stood beneath glittering chandeliers, watching Lady Eleanor Ashford stare at the hand extended before her. Moments earlier, the Alpha King had dismantled months of cruelty with a single declaration. He had placed himself between her and society's judgment. He had accepted responsibility where others offered excuses. Yet despite the magnitude of his gesture, the choice now belonged entirely to her. Not to the kingdom. Not to the newspapers. Not even to him. To her. The realization carried a quiet power. For much of the past year, people had made decisions about her future without permission. They had measured her worth through wealth, reputation, and convenience. They had spoken for her, judged her, and condemned her. Now, at last, she possessed the freedom to answer for herself. Eleanor looked into Alexander's eyes. The same eyes that had once watched her leave a ballroom alone. The same eyes that now held no trace of pride. Only hope. Slowly she placed her gloved hand in his. The hall erupted with whispers. Alexander ignored every one of them. Together they crossed the assembly floor and disappeared through a set of carved doors leading toward the palace gardens. The noise of society faded behind them. Winter greeted them outside. Snow drifted softly from a moonlit sky, settling upon hedges and marble statues. Lanterns illuminated winding pathways while frost transformed every branch into delicate crystal. The palace stood behind them like a glowing monument, yet the world suddenly felt much smaller. Just two people. And everything left unsaid. For several moments they walked in silence. Neither hurried. Neither wished to disturb the fragile honesty that had finally emerged between them. At last they reached a quiet stone pavilion overlooking the frozen gardens. There Alexander stopped. The snow continued falling around them. White, silent, endless. Eleanor faced him calmly. You wished to speak privately. I did. Then speak. No anger colored her voice. No resentment. Only truth. The same truth that had haunted him since the night of the ball. Alexander lowered his gaze briefly. For perhaps the first time in his life he appeared uncertain. The realization touched Eleanor more deeply than she expected. Power had always surrounded him. Confidence had always defined him. Yet now he stood before her stripped of every protection except honesty. When I rejected you, he began quietly, I convinced myself it was necessary. The words disappeared into the winter air. I told myself duty required sacrifice. His jaw tightened. I told myself the crown demanded difficult choices. Eleanor listened without interruption. But none of those explanations mattered after you walked away. A faint breeze stirred the falling snow. Alexander looked directly at her. I expected anger. His voice grew softer. I expected tears. A painful smile appeared briefly. I even expected hatred. The smile vanished. What I never expected was grace. Something shifted inside Eleanor. Not because of what he said. Because of how he said it. Every word sounded earned. Every regret carried weight. Alexander stepped closer. Not enough to overwhelm her. Only enough to remove another layer of distance. Had you wept, I might have forgiven myself. The confession trembled with sincerity. It was your silence that condemned me. The words settled between them. Raw. Unprotected. True. For a long moment neither spoke. The snow continued falling. The kingdom continued existing beyond the palace walls. Yet none of it seemed important. Only this conversation mattered. Only this moment. Alexander drew a slow breath. There has not been a single day when I did not think of you. Eleanor's heart tightened despite her efforts. I remembered every conversation. His eyes never left hers. Every laugh. Another step forward. Every opportunity one allowed fear to destroy. The vulnerability in his voice was unlike anything she had ever witnessed. This was not a king addressing a subject. Not a ruler making a proclamation. This was simply a man confronting the consequences of his own mistakes. And perhaps that was why she believed him. I loved you before the scandal. The admission entered the winter night with breathtaking simplicity. I loved you before your family's fall. His expression remained steady. I loved you before politics convinced me that fear was wisdom. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. The words she had once imagined hearing now felt almost impossible to process. Months ago they would have healed everything instantly. Months ago they would have been enough. But wounds changed people. Pain taught caution. When she opened her eyes again, she found Alexander waiting. Patient. Respectful. Prepared for whatever answer she chose. You hurt me. The statement carried no accusation. Only fact. Alexander nodded. I know. You allowed others to determine my value. I did. You stood silent while society destroyed my reputation. Pain crossed his face. I did. The honesty mattered. Because excuses would have ruined everything. Eleanor studied him carefully. She saw regret. She saw love. Most importantly, she saw understanding. He no longer defended his choices. He understood their cost. For the first time, she believed he truly comprehended what he had taken from her. You cannot erase the past. No. You cannot undo the ballroom. No. Snow gathered upon Alexander's shoulders. Still he remained motionless, listening, accepting, learning. Eleanor looked toward the palace lights glowing through the darkness. 4 months she had carried humiliation like an invisible scar. 4 months she had survived by refusing bitterness. Yet forgiveness had always seemed far more difficult than endurance. Because forgiveness required vulnerability. It required trust. And trust, once broken, demanded courage from both people. Slowly she turned back toward him. "What happens if I forgive you?" The question barely rose above a whisper. Alexander answered without hesitation. "I spend the rest of my life proving it was deserved." Something warm and fragile unfolded within her chest. Not certainty. Not perfection. Hope. The same hope she had spent months trying to extinguish. Tears threatened for the first time since the ballroom. Not tears of humiliation. Not tears of grief. Tears of release. Alexander noticed immediately. Yet he did not move toward her. He did not attempt to comfort her. He simply waited, allowing the choice to remain hers. That, more than any declaration, revealed how deeply he had changed. At last Eleanor smiled. A small smile. A trembling smile. But real. The sight transformed him. Months of regret seemed to leave his shoulders all at once. The relief in his expression was almost heartbreaking. "I cannot promise to forget. I would never ask you to. I cannot promise there will never be difficult days. There will be." Her smile deepened slightly. "You sound remarkably certain." Alexander returned it. "Because I intend to remain beside you during every one of them." A soft laugh escaped her. The first genuine laugh he had heard from her in far too long. And somehow it felt more precious than victory. More precious than power. More precious than a crown. Eleanor extended her hand. This time not because he requested it. Because she chose it. Alexander took it carefully. Reverently. As though accepting something infinitely valuable. Perhaps he was. The snow continued falling around them as they stood together beneath the winter sky. Behind them, the palace glowed with warmth and light. Ahead lay uncertainty, responsibility, and the complicated work of building a future from wounded beginnings. Yet for the first time, neither faced that future alone. Years later, society would remember the king's public declaration. Historians would record the scandal, the controversy, and the astonishing reversal that followed. Newspapers would preserve the speeches. Nobles would repeat the story at countless gatherings. But those who witnessed the truth understood something deeper. The kingdom had not been changed by a powerful man's confession. It had been changed by a woman's silence. Because when humiliation demanded tears, Eleanor Ashford chose dignity. When bitterness offered comfort, she chose grace. And when love finally returned, not wrapped in perfection but in accountability, she chose courage. Together they walked through the falling snow, leaving a single trail of footprints behind them, while the winter night carried them toward a future neither title nor scandal could ever define.